The H2O Podcast.
This is a free download from BBC Radio Solent. The podcast terms and conditions are on the BBC Radio Solent website, along with details of our other podcasts.
The H2O Show
On BBC Radio Solent.
Good afternoon, I'm Robin Knox-Johnston, and this week the programme is being recorded on one of the world's most iconic warships, HMS Victory. Well, we're here because this week the Victory is celebrating 250 years since she was launched. And we're standing alongside her now, looking up at her wonderful site, and massive. When you think when she was built, she is a massive structure. And to think we had almost 30 like her by the time of the Battle of Trafalgar. An enormous output by Britain to do it. With me to tell me a little bit more about it is Andrew Baines, who's the project director for HMS Victory, and he's probably the best person to give me all the information I need to know about her. Thank you for sparing the time to talk to us.
Not at all, you're very welcome.
Tell me a little bit about the Victory. When was she built exactly?
Well, work on Victory begins in 1759, and this is during the 7 Years' War, really the first global conflict. Started in 1756, and the first job for the Royal Navy is to take all the ships that it has in reserve with no crews and no masts and no guns, bring them forward, find crews for them, equip them, and send them to sea. And it takes them, by and large, about 2 years to do that. Once you've done that, your thoughts turn, as a government, to how you increase the size of the Navy. You've got to either catch ships or build more ships. So decide to build more. And so in late 1758, the order is given to lay down a first-rate line of battleship at Chatham Dockyard, and that's where she ends up being built. She's the largest warship in the world. Work begins on her. And 1759 is a great year for Britain as a whole. It's the year of miracles, the year of victories, the Annus Mirabilis, and one of those great victories is obtained by the Royal Navy at the Battle of Quiberon Bay. Very good news for the Royal Navy. Not quite so good news for our Victory, because it means that there's not so pressing a need for her. So instead of the Royal Navy turning her out in 2.5, 3 years, there's a bit of a go slow, and it takes them nearly 6 years to complete her. So she's finally floated out in 1765.
Now, you talk about 6 years to build her, but I mean, she is a massive ship. You say she was the biggest, most powerful warship afloat when she was built. Built of oak? How many trees are required to build her?
A very good question. We think there's about 6,000 trees required to deliver a ship the size of Victory. You have 104 guns that you've got to manufacture to put into the ship. You have got timber that probably comes from North America to construct her masts. We've got timber, of course, from the south of England, especially oak. We've also been doing some investigative work to work out exactly where that oak comes from, and we know that they're pulling it from as far away as Rutland in some instances to get timber down to Chatham, so they're able to complete the ship.
How much did she cost when she was built in those days?
In those days, it's £65,000, which is a lot of money by the standards of the day. Modern comparison, very, very difficult. You can't use the retail price index. The cost of a loaf of bread really doesn't mean anything. But it's around about £1 to £1.2 billion in terms of the size of the government's investment in the ship. So it's a huge investment.
Now, it's enormous, isn't it? You think about it. I mean, that's the cost of a modern destroyer.
Absolutely. That's a pretty reasonable comparison. And when they finish her, the war's over. She's very expensive to man and very expensive to operate at sea, and you don't need her because you're not actually fighting anyone. So she sits off Chatham Dockyard for 13 years. And in those 13 years, having spent £65,000 to build her, the Royal Navy has to spend just over £20,000 maintaining her. And that means taking rotten bits out and putting new bits in. So by the time she's commissioned in 1778, we think they've replaced about a third of the ship.
Already, at that early stage?
At that early stage. From the moment you shake the squirrel out of the tree to cut it down, these things start to degrade. They are inherently biodegradable.
But when you look at a boat like this, I mean, she is enormous. She wasn't particularly fast, I suspect, because of the size of her. But what was her basic purpose? I mean, you talk about her line of battleship, but her purpose was what? Just to be in the line when you came up against another fleet?
It's to control the sea. If you control the sea, we know we control trade, and that's critical for us. There's three sides to the triangle that keeps us strong: the Royal Navy, the Empire, and trade. So we need to control the sea, and to do that we have line of battle ships, the fleet of battle. Everybody who's everybody is building ships like this. The Spanish and the French, they have fleets. Not necessarily with ships as large as Victory. There's always that competition to build bigger, be more powerful. So when she's floated out, and when she's finally commissioned in 78 for the American War of Independence, she becomes popular quite quickly because she's big, and actually she's quite handy, she's quite quick by the standards of the day. She can do fresh out of dry dock with a clean bottom, wind full in her sails and going downhill, about 10 knots, which is not a bad speed for her, for a line of battleship. So that makes her quite popular.
Yes, I bet it does. And if you came across, well, I suppose if you're an enemy fleet and you see the Victory leading a line into you, you'd be a little apprehensive.
Well, you would be. They are designed to look impressive. The days of the huge ornate decoration has gone, because that is very expensive and doesn't add anything to the fighting capability of the ship. But they do look impressive, the way they are painted, the way they are presented, and the way they are handled. And what you do find across the second half of the 18th and into the early 19th century, especially through the Napoleonic conflict, is that increasingly Royal Navy officers in ships like this expect to engage in battle and expect to win, whereas the French will generally regard the mission, protection of their convoys as more important, will not avoid battle, but place protection of a convoy as primary aim. They won't break off to attack, and when they do join battle, they are not quite so confident. So you see an overwhelming psychological dominance develop on the part of the Royal Navy, and we all know that if you think positive and you are confident, then the crew thinks positive, and this really boils down to how quick can you fire your guns compared to your opponent. So it's about morale and battering the enemy into submission. If you have high morale, you've won half the battle already.
Well, you talk about the guns there. When a gun's crew of say a 32-pounder was about 8 people, I think. How many men does she carry?
It's 821 men on board this ship, and the 24-pounders on board we have, so they fire a cannonball weighing 24 pounds. The guns themselves weigh in at about 2.5 tons. They require a gun crew of 12 men. So a huge number of men needed to man the guns, and in fact, with so many guns on board, we can only carry enough men to man either the port side or the starboard broadside. We can't man both sides with full gun crews at the same time. Just not enough men on board.
So you've got all your gun crews, say enough for half the guns, yes, say 50 or so guns, and then you've got what? Your topmen, your sailors, you've got your marines.
Well, everybody will multitask. There's 146 or so marines on board. The sailors themselves, there's the best part of 580 of them on board. Then you have the officers, and then you have people who are really just there for the maintenance of one of these ships, keeping her at sea, keeping her afloat. So the carpenter, his mates, the boatswain who's responsible for the rig, and they all combine to give you those 821 men in really, she's a big ship, but 821 people on board, she's not that big. Conditions are snug, I think would be a nice description.
It's a massive amount of food required there, isn't it? You think you've got to feed those men 3 times a day, and if you're hauling 2 tons in and out, you're using a lot of calories.
Physically, this is hugely demanding work. The men are provided with about 5,000 calories per day. When she's out in the Mediterranean, at any one time, she's carrying about 67 live bullocks on the upper deck, and these are slaughtered as and when they're required. 67 will feed the crew for about 4 weeks. Okay? We carry 250,000 ship's biscuits when we provision for sea. Actually, food is the easier bit. Water is the real problem. And these chaps are getting effectively a gallon of beer per day if it's available. And if you're not getting a gallon of beer, you're getting a pint of wine. And if wine isn't available, then you're down into rum. And each man gets half a pint of rum per day. Now, their rum is a lot stronger than ours. It's equivalent to about 2 bottles of Navy strength rum today. It's fairly potent stuff.
It's massive, isn't it? But of course the men have got to have that. But of course the reason we're giving them beer is because it doesn't go off like water does.
Absolutely. You carry water goes breakage quite quickly, and we tend to use it for cooking and only for cooking. The salted meat, there's so much salt in this stuff that it will float. The barrel will float if you chuck it into the water. It's really, really well salted. So you have to rinse as much of that out as you can. By today's standards, it wouldn't be terribly palatable, but by the standards of the day, it's a good meal. You are getting a joint of meat every day. You are very well looked after. So there's a massive industry around supplying the fleet. There's also a huge industry and huge effort to keep the men healthy, because that's the biggest issue we have, feeding the insatiable appetite of the Navy for men. And you spend a lot of time and effort training men and sourcing them by this stage. There's lots of competition. Everybody's heard of the press gang, whose job it was to go and really effectively take sailors from the merchant fleets and put them into the Royal Navy. Not quite half of Victory's crew is pressed into service. So once you've put all the effort into getting them, you want to keep them healthy, and you do that with food and also with medicine. So Nelson places huge emphasis on the physicians of the fleet. And actually, when we go into battle at Trafalgar, there's nobody who has to sit out the battle because they're unwell. Everybody takes part, which is a real testament to the achievement of the physicians of the fleet and Nelson's desire to make sure his men are well looked after.
And yes, vital, of course. Now look, standing here, Andrew, looking at her, she's only got her lower masts installed at the moment. You can look along her, and she's got what it's called Nelson's checker, isn't it?
It is, yes.
That sort of buff colour. Yeah. Now, did she have that originally, or did she had white for lining up the guns?
So when she is floated out, and when first commissioned, the sides are unpainted. They're just covered in rosin, so it's like a varnish.
Yeah.
This paint scheme is introduced, this style of paint is introduced in 1803 when Nelson takes her out to the Mediterranean, and survives through until 1815 when she's taken over to a black and white paint scheme. We've done a lot of research at the moment, and we're just looking at going back to a colour that is more authentic. Actually, we've found some references to the paint scheme Nelson actually used at Trafalgar.
Well, that's the outside of the vessel. Can we go inside?
By all means, come and see what else we have to show you on the ship.
Thanks, Andrew. Lead on.
The H2O Show
With Sir Robin Knox-Johnston.
on BBC Radio Solent.
Rum rather than cider, or a call to arms. And this is how it would have looked aboard the Victory at the Battle of Trafalgar. The Navy recreates the scene of its most famous battle aboard the actual ship that led the attack.
And that's a report from Pathé News in 1967, as they described the Trafalgar as it happened demonstration on board HMS Victory. And that's where I am today for this special H2O show, marking her 250th anniversary. I'm Robin Knox-Johnston, and with me is Andrew Baines, the project director. Well, Andrew, here we are underneath the hull, down at the bottom of the dry dock, and we're looking up at her hull. As we come down, you look at the forefoot there, that wood does look very old. Is that original?
It is very old. Originally, it's really a difficult concept for us on Victory. As I said earlier, by the time this ship's commissioned, a third of her has been replaced. So we tend to talk about what's significant, what material can really tell part of the ship's story. So this is definitely significant. We've got the keel you can see. That is almost certainly dating to 1759 to 1765. Underneath that, we have a false keel, which is again made of elm. It's a very good material if it's immersed in water, and it's got a very irregular grain, which means you can drive lots of bolts through it and it doesn't split. Down here, the keel is the ship's spine, if you like, so you have a lot of bits of timber secured to it, a lot of fixings, so you want something that won't split. And so that false keel we have is probably not quite as old as the keel. Gut feeling 1800, 1803, but we don't know for sure. It's very difficult to date elm itself.
Right. And looking above that, the planking actually does look much newer, so that's clearly been a replacement.
Absolutely. The ship was dry docked in 1922. Placed in this dock permanently from that point, and since then we've had 90 odd years of various attempts of restoration and maintenance and repair, and a lot of the bottom planking has been replaced. You'll see occasional planks, one over there for example, look a lot older. That's because they are, but what we are looking at here dates largely to the 1950s actually.
Right, that reason. I mean, what thickness are those planks though?
Down here, it varies hugely. The majority of the bottom, you're looking about a 4-inch thickness on a plank. Some of the thickest planks we have on the hull are getting up towards 10 inches thick. So very, very thick lumps of timber. 10 inches thick, 12 inches wide, 24, 26 feet long. So manhandling these into place on the ship, and bearing in mind that when we need to bend, as we need to bend the planks to fit the curve of the bow, you're going to be steaming these things on the dock side and then getting them quickly into place and using the heat to allow you to pull that plank into shape. It would have been an impressive thing to see, for sure, to watch fairly beefy blokes chucking these things around.
And requires very skilled shipwrights.
Very, very skilled shipwrights. And that's the problem with these ships, and that's why they take so long. Training a shipwright takes years and years and years, 8 years easily, for you to get to a competent level in what would be required. And we need hundreds of shipwrights in the dockyards to allow us to turn out Royal Naval ships and also merchant ships. Yeah. To allow us to undertake trade.
Putting that in context, that's longer than it takes to train a doctor.
This is very important work, you know.
Now, I notice, just looking as we came down, there's a bent plate, probably 1.5 inches thick, that's just been bent up. Now, you said that there was some bomb damage. Is that the result of that?
It is indeed. Nice point here about the difference between original material and significant material. We're stood here on the night of the 10th of March 1941 in a bombing raid over Portsmouth. A 250 kilogram German bomb drops in between the side of the ship and the side of the dock, hits the dock bottom about where we are stood and detonates. It destroys some of the supports that the ship sits on. It blows a great big hole in this wall that sits under her keel, destroys some of the keel, and is strong enough to turn that plate, which is, what, 1.5 inches thick, turn it up at the corner, and the explosive force vents up through the ship. So the damage we have here and the repair, for us, is significant because it tells an important part of the ship's story, and actually quite an interesting part of the ship's story. We were very worried about the impact, damage that to Victory could have on the nation's morale, and the Germans, of course, claim it as a great coup because it's PR, and you want to claim you've destroyed this symbol of British heroic valour in the Battle of Trafalgar. So the first thing you do is get lots of people walking around in front of Victory with the newspaper printed that day, very carefully framing the shot so there's no sign of any damage.
Poor old Mr. Goebbels, he had to answer that one. In fact, if you look at the keel, you can see the new timber in this area, can't you? And the older timber either side of it.
You can, absolutely. This is very much a running repair. So it's a bit rough around the edges, for sure. The repair's been executed in teak, whereas the rest of the keel is elm. Now, if you're a real purist, you might say, I'd prefer to see this piece replaced with elm, but you would lose a part of the story. Yes. And we're here looking after not just Victory at Trafalgar or Victory as floated out, but Victory as a 250-year-old museum object. She's a great big museum object, but a museum object nevertheless, and we're trying to tell that whole story.
Andrew, it's interesting looking at what may well be an original keel of elm, but it's almost like giant staples are holding the various sections together.
Absolutely. The keel's a really important part of the structure. You can't afford for any damage to that whatsoever. But charts at this time are not as detailed as you would always wish them to be. You're going into places you might not have a very good understanding of, so you need to protect the keel. So you staple onto it these other pieces of timber, which are the false keel, and that is designed so that if the ship runs aground or touches a shoal, the false keel will be torn off, the staples will break, but the keel itself will be kept safe and kept intact.
But that's a major operation, putting another section of keel on it. That would require a dry dock.
Absolutely. You would then have to return to a major dockyard facility such as Portsmouth or Plymouth or Chatham by the early 19th century, and you would bring her into dry dock, you'd dock her out, you'd sit her on the keel blocks, and then you would have to remove all the blocks upon which she sat around the repair and then undertake the repair. So there will be a forest of timber supports stood around us now, holding the ship up, holding the keel in place while that repair was executed.
But these dry docks, I mean, they're basically like the ones we've got today. I mean, they're a hole in the ground with a gate at one end, and you pump the water out once the ship's in.
Absolutely. The dry dock in which we are stood is reputed to be one of the oldest in the world. In its current guise, it's about 210 years old. This one went out of use, obviously, when they put Victory in it in 1922. But some of the others we have in the base, which are of a similar age, were in use right up until 15, 20 years ago, when ships have just gotten to a stage where they're too big to fit in. Victory sits fairly snugly in this dock. And the story of how they get her in here, and actually what do you do with Victory? You decide you want to save her, and actually that decision is made more or less in 1914. The worst possible moment to be talking about a major conservation project, because a few months later we all know what happens, and that derails things for a good 5-6 years. So in 1914, Victory had been in very good state of repair. The Navy's very pleased with her, everyone admires her. By the 1920s, that's not true. No money has been spent on maintaining the ship through the Great War, with more important things to be concentrating on. And as anyone who has a ship, a boat, knows, if you do not spend money on maintenance, things go bad very, very quickly, especially on a timber ship such as this. So she's actually in danger of sinking at her moorings. So there's an emergency program that really gets her into the dock very quickly. January of 1922, they get her into the dock with the intent of looking after her and preserving her, but there's no money available, and the Navy cannot spend money on restoring her to her Trafalgar condition. They're happy to paint her and stop things getting worse, but they're not prepared to spend money improving her. So the Society for Nautical Research steps in and launches the Save the Victory campaign, which raises the funds necessary to undertake that first stage of restoration and really deliver her, as most people who visited her over the next 90 years would recognise the ship.
You've come on to what happened post-Trafalgar, which of course is her most famous moment, really. But in between, at the end of the Napoleonic War, what happened to her then?
She comes into Portsmouth in 1812. We are at war. We're at war with Napoleon at that time. We're also at war with the United States of America, the War of 1812. But we don't need very large ships, line of battle ships like Victory for either of those conflicts in the numbers that we have them. Victory's quite old. She's approaching 50 by that point. So she's brought into harbour and she sits in reserve just in case you need another ship. By 1814, the Navy's decided that they want to repair her and they want to make that she's in a condition to go to sea and fight again if they need her to. So she's placed into number 3 dock, actually where the Mary Rose Museum and the Mary Rose Hull now sit, and is taken through a great repair that lasts from 1814 to 1816, and she's almost rebuilt. They really undertake a huge amount of repair to the ship to make sure she's fit to lie in the line of battle in years to come. By the time that's finished, 1816, yet again, a war has finished. There's no need for the ship, so she's placed in ordinary. She sits there for almost 10 years until she's brought forward and serves as the residence of the captain of the ordinary, the captain of reserve. And through the 1820s and 30s, she does various roles as an accommodation ship and as a floating office for senior naval officials. She also becomes a tourist attraction. No visit to Portsmouth is complete without a visit to Victory to stand on the spot where Nelson fell and stand on the spot where he died. So that kind of thing takes off. But by the 1830s, the Royal Navy has decided they're never going to use her. She's small by battleship standards of the day. So they're going to cut the top deck off her and convert her into a 2-decker. And there's a huge public outcry. This can't possibly happen. The memory of Trafalgar and Nelson and Howe and Kempenfelt, all these other admirals is sacred. And so a public campaign really swings into action, and the Navy backs down and agrees that she will permanently be the residence for a senior officer in Portsmouth. And that really secures her through until the late 19th century.
So we nearly lost her, actually, but fortunately she's still here with us. Well, thanks, Andrew.
The H2O Show
on BBC Radio Solent.
Well, here we are, still at HMS Victory, and I'm with Andrew, who's looking after the ship. And we've moved down to the stern now. And Andrew, I'm looking at what was probably the original keel still.
Absolutely. We've got the keel here of elm, probably dating to the time the ship was constructed and floated out in 1765. You can see with these huge fish plates that are used to clamp these big pieces of timber, the keel and the stern post, the bit of timber that rises up at the back end keel, hold it all together. We've got the rudder hanging off these huge pintles, hinges at the back end. And for us, looking after the ship, this is one of the biggest conservation issues we have. This rudder is 200 years old. You can see where it's corroded and pitted from where Victory was sitting in the mud of Portsmouth Harbour for the best part of 110 years. And we've got to find a way now to stop that corroding further and to stop the timber breaking apart, as you can see the keel here doing here. And that's a real challenge for us.
When you feel this timber, it is quite fibrous, isn't it? It's like a cloth on the surface now.
It is. It's very, very spongy. What we've got here, the keel has sat in water for 150 years, and it's absorbed all that water, and it's absorbed a lot of salt. The other issue you have with the keel is that it's made of elm. As I said, elm is fantastic immersed in water. Very good timber. It's excellent if it's kept dry. If it's kept in a moist environment, however, like we have here, you have a problem. And what is happening here actually is that salt in the timber is crystallizing and in effect blowing apart the wood cells in a very basic term. So an analogy for this, it's almost like freeze thawing on a rock, if people remember their high school geography, and that we shed a very thin layer of timber at a time, and then it moistens up and the salt crystallizes and then blows apart some more cells and another layer of the timber degrades. Very, very slow process. It's not going to damage the ship hugely in 5 years, it's not going to damage it hugely in 10 years, but in 50 years or 100 years, the time frames we're thinking about, we're custodians of Victory in perpetuity, we need to find a solution to this problem.
The H2O Show
on BBC Radio Solent.
This is H2O. This week I'm recording the show on board HMS Victory.
On this day, 150 years ago, Horatio Nelson, Britain's greatest admiral, died at the moment of his greatest triumph. From the deck of the Victory, he smashed Napoleon's dream of conquering Europe. On that deck, he died. His statue looks down on a land that honors him, not merely as the winner of a battle, but as the creator of a navy which still lives, fights, and wins by his tradition.
That's how Pathy News reported the 150th anniversary of the Battle of Trafalgar in October 1955. And of course, in 2005, BBC Radio Solent was here to mark the 200th.
The Queen boarded HMS Victory for a special dinner in the cabin of Nelson's flagship, an occasion relished by the then First Sea Lord, Admiral Sir Alan West.
The thing that's really made me so pleased is I do think this has caught the British people's imagination. I mean, there is a certain element of a Nelson fever everywhere you look, and I think that's great, and I think British people occasionally like to be proud of something they should be proud of, and it's so wonderful to have Her Majesty there, who will be speaking live on television, giving her toast the immortal memory.
Marcus White reporting from 2005. Now that was the 200th anniversary of the Battle of Trafalgar. Now we're marking the 250th anniversary of the flagship of the Royal Navy at the time, HMS Victory. With me is Victory's project director, Andrew Baines. Andrew, well, you brought us down onto a gun deck. This is the lower gun deck?
This is the lower gun deck.
And how many guns have we got here?
We've got 30 32-pounders on this deck. This is the heart of Victory as a fighting machine. This is where the heaviest guns are based, therefore the most powerful guns. This is also where the majority of the crew lived on board. We can sleep 600 men on this one deck, and we can feed 480.
So, yeah, what we're looking at, of course, is these 9 of very, very large guns, each of which can throw a ball weighing 32 pounds. How far could they throw that?
Well, they can throw the ball out to about 1.25 miles or so. You wouldn't hit what you're aiming at, but you can throw it that far. Realistically, they're used at point-blank range, which is 200 to 300 yards maximum.
Actually, that seems incredibly close to me.
It is. When they get in to Trafalgar, they're fighting at a lot closer. When you say point-blank for Trafalgar, you are saying that the hulls are hull to hull. You can see the person you are shooting at on the ship you are shooting at. You actually can't see the ship because you can only see a very small part of it that's visible through the gun port because it's so close. 2, 3, 4 feet away from those ports.
Now, how thick is the planking at this point on the ship then?
The hull planking at this point is about 10 inches thick. Internally, we're heading up towards 6, 8 inches thick. Overall, the ship is getting on for 2.5 feet thick at this point. very, very thick sides.
A 32-pound ball would come through that?
Yes, with no trouble whatsoever. In fact, one of the difficulties you have when you don't want to punch a nice, neat hole in your opponent, because the cannonball will go straight through. You've got to hit someone with the cannonball to damage them with the cannonball. What you really want to do is create splinters. So you want the cannonball with enough energy to hit the hull, smash through, and turn jagged lumps of timber out of the ship. Splinters. Those splinters will pinwheel across the deck, and it's those that will do the killing and the maiming.
That's impressive, isn't it? So here we are down, we've got these guns lined up on each side of the ship, and in between there's a table. That was the mess table where that gun's crew would feed, is it?
Absolutely, the men would eat here. What we have, the primary concern is in designing Victory is the gun, the number of guns we're going to carry and the weight of guns. Once you know the number of guns, you can work out the length of the keel. That gives you the size of the hull. The very bottom of the consideration is where do you slot in all the chaps who are meant to operate this machine. They slot in between the guns. So their hammocks would be slung here from hammock battens. These are pieces of timber you can see nailed to the beams themselves, and they eat and generally spend their leisure time around the guns at the mess table.
And so, in action, you'll be, as you said earlier, be manning one side, but if the target came the other side, you presumably have already run those guns out loaded, so you could nip across and fire them.
When we clear for action on the morning of Trafalgar, we have a long time before we're going to be within range of the fleet. Nelson goes on deck just after first light, about 5 o'clock in the morning, and we don't open our fire with our guns until 10 past midday. So you have a lot of time. So all of the gun crew here would come down, they'd clear away the mess tables, all the fixtures and fittings that are not absolutely essential for fighting the ship. They'd prepare the guns on both sides. They then settle down to lunch. There's a problem, however. The stove, the fire's out and the stove's been collapsed, so it's not going to cause any splinters because it's made of iron, which would splinter if it was hit. So for lunch, on the day of the Battle of Trafalgar, the guys down here have had a little raw pork and a pint of white wine, and they're then sent off to fight the battle and mount up with the guns. If you had an enemy on both sides of you, you'd actually man every other gun down each side. You'd try not to split the gun crew in two, because the guns are heavy, physically demanding to operate them. The men get tired out too quickly if you split the gun crew in two.
How long were they firing for on Trafalgar?
Victory's firing for 4 hours and 20 minutes. From the ship, we fired 3,041 rounds, cannonballs if you like. We used 7.5 tons of black powder. We used 3 tons of wadding, and thrown into the mix is another 3,000 musket balls that have been let loose from this ship. And a broadside from Victory, when we break through the line, 1.5 tons of metal, travelling at about 500 miles an hour. So carnage is not a big enough word to describe what is inflicted by Victory when she is operating at her peak.
It's impressive, isn't it? I mean, that's over 30 rounds per cannon during the course of the battle.
Yes. British gunners could achieve a rate of fire of around about 1 round every 90 seconds if they were really up and well trained and at their peak. The French Navy were closer to 1 round every 2.5 to 3 minutes. The Spanish was somewhat slower, about 1 round every 5 minutes. And of course, to batter your enemy into submission, it all boils down to the rate of fire, and that's what everything about Nelson's tactics are designed to bring on, what he terms this pell-mell battle, whereby his advantage in the rate of gunnery can really be brought to bear. The enemy have more ships, they have more men, about 8,000 more men, and about 470 odd more guns. How do you level that? How do you even that out? Well, his tactics are to split the line into 3. One portion of that line, the French line, has got to turn round against the wind. That's going to take them a long time to do. So we've already dismissed a portion of the French fleet, and then our superior rate of fire with the guns can really come to tell on the French and Spanish ships remaining.
And it was most effective, wasn't it?
Very, very effective. 19 ships captured in the course of the battle, and we mop up another half dozen or so across the next 2 weeks.
And that's out of 33 in total, of course.
Out of 33 in total. Nelson He's led on the orlop. He's mortally wounded. He becomes obsessed with speaking to Hardy. He's convinced Hardy's been killed in the battle. He's very close. Hardy's one of only a handful of men that survive the upper deck of Victory. Hardy eventually finds time in the fairly hectic world of fighting a line of battleship in the course of a very large naval battle to go down below and tell Nelson that he's secured, he thinks, 16 or 17 prizes, because they don't have the exact figure. And Nelson's reaction is, I had bargained on 20, he's not satisfied. So I personally think 19 isn't too bad, but Nelson was after 20.
That was an overwhelming victory, in fact. I mean, I don't think there's been any other victory where we've been so conclusively destroyed an enemy fleet.
No, a battle which obtains a victory so overwhelming is very, very unusual at sea.
Yeah. And, of course, there weren't any more big battles after that for the next 10 years of the war.
No, nothing on the scale of Trafalgar.
Well, it's absolutely fascinating, Andrew, and very impressive, actually, though you and I, being fairly tall, have to duck a little bit down here, don't we? This is meant for a smaller generation than us. But perhaps we can go up on deck and have a look at where Nelson fell and look around the main deck.
Certainly, let's head to the quarterdeck.
The most famous ship in British naval history is looking more than usually spick and span after being re-rigged, which was no small task. 34 miles of Italian hemp have been required with 3 tons of spun yarn to replace Victory's old sisal ropes. In these times, when big sailing ships can be counted almost on one hand, the making of such ropes might have become a lost art. Fortunately for HMS Victory and the thousands who visit her every year, it still flourishes. Not being sailors in the old sense of the word, the riggers went up the easy way. Even then, they probably had some idea of what it must have been like hauling in sail with a gale blowing. But who can imagine Victory in action on that October day, 1805, when Nelson won the Battle of Trafalgar? As a reward for their work, 16 riggers were dressed up as sailors of Nelson's day and invited aboard. What a heartthrob Jack Tar must have been 150 years ago. On the right occasion, the order comes, splice the main brace. In civilian language, that means a tot of rum all round. Times have changed, but men are much the same, and Navy rum as good as ever. Civilians the riggers may be, but they were no laggards when it came to this splicing the main brace business. With all this new rigging, maybe next year they'll enter Victory in the tall ships race.
Well, that was 1964, and the rigging is down once again. More than 2 centuries on from the Battle of Trafalgar, Victory is in urgent need of repair once again. With me is Andrew Baines, Victory's project director. Well, Andrew, we're standing here on the main deck, basically, looking up at the mast, but we've only got the main mast in, haven't we? We haven't got the top mast.
We've got lower masts, we're missing the top masts, we're missing the topgallants. Actually, as Victory appears today, this is very close to what she looked like on October the 22nd of 1805, the morning after the Battle of Trafalgar. The top masts were taken down in 2011 because one of the problems you have with a lot of rig, and there's 25, 26 miles of rope in the ship's rig, and those huge masts, is when the wind blows, as it does in Portsmouth Harbour, they carry a huge amount of force, and they can transmit that force to the ship's hull. And one of the challenges we are faced with at the moment is that Victory for 40 years has been very slowly falling in on herself at about a half a centimetre a year. That can't continue, and the loading from the mast was contributing to that and causing us a problem. So we have, over the past 3 years, since she was transferred from the Royal Navy to the National Museum of the Royal Navy, we've been embarked upon a programme of work to make sure we understand the problems and we are working out the best solutions to them.
So she's going to stay like this for a while you sort out the best solution for her?
She's going to be like this for a while. Aesthetically, the masts are very, very important. But we are looking at Victory in a very long time frame. We've taken her, and we are custodians of her in perpetuity, forever, in effect. She's 250 years old on the 7th of May. We want to make sure she's here in another 250 years. That means we have to make sure that the ship's hull and the timbers forming part of the hull, the keel and so on and so forth, the timbers are conserved, they are well supported, and the structure as a whole works and then we can reinstate the rig.
So it's not short-term fixes you're looking at all, it's long-term conservation.
This is very, very long-term conservation. We are looking at a programme, by the time we complete it, will have been running for almost 20 years, we think.
Gosh, it's a long time to work on it. But in the meantime, she's open to the public. We're standing on the deck. There's lots of members of the public walking around here with us. And in fact, down below, there's not much, well, there's no changes going to occur there that one would notice, is there?
Certainly. I think last year we welcomed just over 400,000 visitors to the ship. She is open to the public 362 days to the year. And if you come down to Victory today, yes, the topmasts are missing, but your visit will not be impacted in any other way. When we do begin the major conservation work, that will impact upon the ship, but that will be part of the visit. Nowhere else in the world can you come and see a first-rate line of battleship being worked on. These techniques that are 200-300 years old will be in use to look after Victory and make sure she's in a good condition. We're not going to put big barriers up and hide that work. We want to make it accessible for people so you can see some of these fantastic skills that we're helping to keep alive.
Of course, Andrew, it's not just the fact that actually she is the only surviving ship of the line from 200 years ago anywhere in the world. So she has huge historic importance, really, for anyone interested in history and the development of warships. But she still has a place within the Navy today.
She certainly does. Although she's no longer owned by the Royal Navy, she's part of the National Museum, she is a commissioned ship. She has a commanding officer. She's the flagship of the First Sea Lord. She's a very important role for today's Royal Navy. Where else can you take RN officers and bring them somewhere where they can touch and have that strong connection with Nelson, who really, for the RN, epitomises ideas of bravery and leadership and how you go about waging war and how you go about fighting battles?
That's very true. Of course, Nelson was a bit of a maverick in his time, wasn't he? I mean, the Battle of St Vincent, where he broke the line. Could be court-martialed for that, instead of which he captured 2 ships.
I think the beauty of Nelson is that he arrives at a time where the Royal Navy absolutely needs someone who is hell-bent on achievement. They have a clear vision of what needs to be done, and he will go and do that. And he's very, very good at achieving. He's also very, very good at self-promotion, so he always makes sure it's his accounts of the battles that get back, and his modest accounts of daring do that he sends to friends he's very certain are going to send them onto the paper. So that helps for him. But certainly he's all about achievement. And what is the deliverable? In modern terms we talk about when we're restoring Victory. What is the deliverable? What do we want to achieve? That's what Nelson's all about, and that is very important for today's RN.
And of course, what we mustn't forget is, of course, he was very lucky with the First Sea Lord at the time, Earl of St Vincent, whose wonderful comment in the House of Lords I always quote to people in answer to a question. He said, "I never said the French couldn't invade. I just said they couldn't invade by sea." And of course, he was probably right.
I think he was right, yes.
But today we don't have 700 or 800 crew. How many people have you got actually working on board at the moment?
Well, the Royal Navy has quite a small crew. There's about a dozen people that are permanently stationed to Victory. On top of that, we of course have the National Museum of the Royal Navy staff who are here to make sure the ship operates for our visitors and they can get round. And then we have the maintenance crew, and that varies. The core team is 5 people, and they are responsible for the day-to-day conservation maintenance, the repairs to the caulking of the deck you can see today, the minor repairs for water ingress and so on and so forth. When we get into larger conservation projects, then the size of that team has to increase. So we have rigging specialists, we have shipwright specialists, we have engineers who come down, and we have conservators we bring on board. So the size of the team expands and contracts dependent upon the task in hand. But it's relatively modest compared to the 821 chaps in 1805.
It certainly is. So we've got this great big anniversary coming up. How are you going to celebrate it?
I think 2015 is probably going to be Victory's most important year since 1805. In the immediate term, on Saturday night, on the 9th, we've got a musical concert taking place in the arena. But looking to the longer view, 2015, the 250th anniversary for us is about signing off on all that work and then progressing the work, which guarantees Victory is going to be around for another 250 years. So we've got some major conservation programs taking place this year. We're going to put a new support system into the ship to keep her from falling in and stop any further movement. We're going to announce the major work that's needed to the hull, many millions of pounds, and taking us over the next decade and a half or so. And we're also looking at a reinterpretation and re-display of Victory, which will happen towards the end of this year. So visitors coming round towards Easter of 2016, there will be a new route through the ship. You will see areas of the ship open up that haven't been available before, and we're really aiming to make sure you get a better and more in-depth understanding of what it was like to work and live and fight on one of these things at the time of Nelson.
Well, Andrew, I can't thank you enough for taking the time to show us around. And any listeners out there, let me tell you, if you've got the time, it is well worth coming down. She is iconic, but she's so special just to realise this was what built up Britain into a major international power. Ships like this are what did it, created the empire. And it's well worth coming down just to see what it was like for those men on board and how this little island nation achieved it. Thank you to Andrew Baines and, of course, to Portsmouth Historic Dockyard for allowing us to board HMS Victory. Next week, I'm back for a second Historic Dockyard special from the National Museum of the Royal Navy.